We're glad you're here with us to go inside the courtroom. I'm Andrea Dearden here with Erica Stapleton. Erica, this is what we expect to be the third and final trial for Lori Vallow, again on trial for conspiracy to commit murder in Arizona. So let's just give a brief overview about just the quickest little overview of the case, and then we'll kind of walk people through kind of what's happened leading up to this in the last few weeks, few days, and then where we're going next.
Well, Andrea, is anything ever quick with this case? You know, we've been covering this for the past 5+ years, from Idaho to Arizona to Hawaii and, all these different places. And as you said, yes, this is the last trial that we are expecting here in Arizona. And I think that's there's been no other charges brought against her. But this latest case, on the heels of a case she was just convicted for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. We were inside the courtroom for that case. And I know we were inside the courtroom in Idaho back in 2023, where she was convicted for killing her children, Tylee and JJ, and her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. So huge backstory there. But the case that we are focusing on right now is actually out of Gilbert, Arizona, and it stems from a shooting incident back in October 2019. And the person who is the victim in this case, allegedly, is Brandon Boudreaux. That is a name we've heard before, but it's not the case, or not the name that's been in the forefront of all these cases. He is Lori Vallow's niece's ex-husband. So a lot of people removed there, but it's believed by investigators that Lori's brother, Alex Cox, another familiar name, shot at Brandon Boudreaux while he was driving back to his home in Gilbert. He was right in his neighborhood, in his car, and a bullet essentially shattered the driver's side window. And he was not hit, but he did continue driving away. He called 911. They responded to the scene. The shooter had fled, but it was a person, again, now believed to be Lori's brother, Alex Cox, in a Jeep, a green Jeep that was ultimately linked to Lori and Tylee, her daughter. It was a Jeep that was ultimately, I believe, found in Idaho. So that's kind of the backstory here. And the charge that Lori is facing in this case is another murder conspiracy charge. And this case is a little different, Andrea, because the victim is still alive. Mr. Boudreaux, we're expecting he will be in the courtroom. He will be testifying in this case. And he's been involved in some of these pretrial hearings. So we are, interested to finally hear from him, because he maybe did an interview way back in early on before all of this unraveled. But he's been pretty quiet as not to disrupt the proceedings, other than maybe a statement after some of the convictions in these cases. Obviously, this has been a huge impact on him.
Right. And he did give a written statement. I believe he was there for parts of the last trial. But this is the only living victim, if you will, of Lori Vallow that we know of in terms of these charges that have been brought against her. So that will be probably the most interesting, seeing him take the stand and be able to, of course, he will be the key witness in all of this. And, we'll surely see that the information that he gave police right after that shooting, I'm sure that they will play all of that, the information there, that interaction with the officer where I believe he initially thought that it was like a BB gun, or, maybe just I don't think realized maybe the severity of it or the risk that he perhaps was in, or the danger he was in when that happened. And it'll be interesting to see, him talk about kind of at what point did he connect dots, or how did he feel after realizing that it was likely Alex Cox who fired at him. I mean, that to me is what I'm very interested to see how much of that we'll hear.
Yeah. And I'll say that one of the prosecutors in the Idaho cases, the cases being Lori Vallow, of course, and then Chad Daybell, who has been convicted in the deaths of Lori's children, Tylee and JJ, and his first wife, Tammy Daybell. He was sentenced to death in Idaho. But what I was told by one of the prosecutors, Rachel Smith, she was assigned to work on that case, and out of, town prosecutor coming in to help out, she, Brandon Boudreaux testified in some of those cases. She said he was her witness. She prepped him for, the trials in Idaho. And she said that he was instrumental in connecting the dots here. And thinking back to late 2019, early 2020, I know here at 12 News in Phoenix, it was really his divorce filings from his former wife, Melanie, where we started to learn some of the dark religious beliefs in this case. We were able to see there was discussion of zombies, how he was worried for, maybe some of the children involved in this case. And that was really when at that key moment when things were starting to unravel. So he's been a huge part of all of these investigations. And what Rachel Smith said, again, the prosecutor, was like, she hopes that he finally has his time to say, his piece in court. He has his day in court now.
Well, and he did, he also, his name comes up, and I know we saw it in the last trial, the text messages. It seemed that there were several people that Lori and Alex and Chad were concerned about, or names that kept coming up in those text messages about, needing to get rid of them, or needing to, talking about zombies and who is dark, and keeping them out of the picture. Different people pop up, and Brandon is a name that we have seen multiple times in different contexts. And his ex-wife is somebody who, in her trials here in Idaho, was described as somebody who was more like a sister, or thought of Lori more like a big sister, very close. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about why we haven't seen her charged, because I think that is a question that a lot of people are still continuing to ask, because she does seem very connected and did seem to have a lot of information, at the very least, a lot of information about what was going on, and, certainly was a part of that inner circle, if you will, between Lori and Alex and Chad, it seemed.
Yeah. Absolutely. And not just, I think we get the question too, why was she maybe not charged here, but also why has she not testified? Even if she does, if she does have all this information, we know that she was interviewed by police. She's done interviews with news outlets, including me here, before in 2020, before Tylee and JJ's bodies were found in Chad Daybell's backyard. So that was a long time ago, but we know that she was involved in all of this. And as you said, we will definitely unpack that a little more later, but I do want to get to what happened today in court, because we are expecting, as I said, things are never fast moving here. Despite Lori wanting to have a speedy trial, we were in the courtroom today. We are expecting to have a jury finalized ahead of opening statements that were supposed to be starting Monday morning, but we got into the courtroom this afternoon and the judge said, we're going to have to delay. I'm sorry to everyone that came in here. There was about just under 70 people that came into the courtroom ready to, possibly be selected as a juror for this case. And the judge apologized. He said he's cognizant of their time, but something, an unforeseen circumstance came up, and nothing was officially said because it might be sensitive information, but the scuttlebutt around the courthouse was that Lori Vallow Daybell indicated she might not have been feeling well, that she was sick. We tried to get this confirmed officially, but no one, everyone kind of was dancing around it. But that was the belief, was that she was not feeling well. The judge even said before, ultimately closing court for the day, he said, let us know if you might not be able to make it here Monday. Sometimes you get quarantined at the jail. So again, there were a lot of indications that she was the one who maybe wasn't feeling well, and that could have led to this delay to Monday. So what we are expecting is that jury selection will continue Monday morning. We know that the judge said, there was a little bit that happened today. He said, we can't go through side by side asking our questions today. We have to continue that portion. But he essentially said, if you can't make it back here Monday, raise your hand. He went through, and a lot of people disclosed having, family issues, maybe having work issues. And we could tell the judge, this is Judge Justin Boreski, the same judge that's been on this case with Lori Vallow Daybell in Arizona, her previous trial, and he's been on this trial as well. He said the questionnaire was supposed to kind of weed this out. So they did lose some more people. So we're expecting a smaller group to come back on Monday, and that jury to theoretically be finalized. And something we haven't mentioned yet, at least not in this session, Andrea, is that Lori Vallow Daybell is representing herself. So as we continue in the jury selection process, it'll be the judge kind of going through a list of questions with these people in person. And then the state will have an opportunity to ask some questions. And then Lori herself, because she's representing herself, will be able to answer some questions. And, this is not a process that it's a sealed process, so we don't have video for that, but the rest of the trial will be live streamed. So I'm curious what you're thinking about knowing that we're getting another trial here with Lori Vallow Daybell representing herself, having that interaction with the jurors.
Well, what's interesting, I think, is finding a jury. So since she was just on trial, and because that trial certainly got attention. We talked about it. You talked about it. You reported it there in Arizona daily. And so it will be interesting to see if if there's that issue, will it be tough to find people who don't know about her? Now, does the questionnaire weed those folks out too? Or are we assuming that the people who are showing up here have said they don't have any knowledge of her?
Well, that's what they said. And that's, I know it might be different in some other states, and I know in Idaho, the jury selection process definitely took more than a day or two.
Yes.
But that's what the questionnaires are for here in Arizona, at least in Maricopa County. They are sent out, designed to try and weed out people who have familiarity with the case. And we'll get into how these pretrial conferences have been going. But that was something that Lori argued with the judge about, saying, well, why does my name need to be in here? That's just going to prompt someone to look people up. And he's like, well, that's exactly why we need to have your name in here, so people know who we're talking about. In fact, if we just brought a bunch of people in and someone stood up and said, I know her from her case in Idaho, that could taint the entire panel that they bring in. So that's really really the point here. And for this case, we know that about 300 questionnaires went out to possible jurors. Most of those people, of course, that, not everybody checks their mail or different things. So most of those people responded. We know some people showed up in person today, and those, were able to fill out the questionnaires in person, but most people can do this online. And that is designed to weed people out who either have conflicts with their life, their work, their family, biases with police. That was one that came up a little bit. There was someone who had been screened said that they actually reported on this case as a legal consultant. So, it's designed to weed people out who surely cannot be an impartial juror. And it seems like we'll still have a pretty big pool to pick from come Monday morning.
Maybe it's because we're so close to this, but it was surprising the last time. And I know that we'll talk about that. It definitely came up after the trial about, possible information about her and her previous convictions. And so it's just hard to imagine that people haven't heard of her or have not seen anything about her. So maybe it's just because that's the world we live in, and because, that's the kind of information and the kind of news that we follow. But that always is surprising to me that they can find that many people who just have no idea.
Well, it certainly is. And I think, Maricopa County, I was going to say, no. But to put it in context too, as you said, Andrea, not everybody is, in this bubble that we are in. I do think this is high profile. I think we are, with this case, maybe it won't be as highly attended or highly publicized compared to other trials because there was not a death in this case. But I think there's still a lot of interest. And of course, we're going to be following because we're interested in, hearing from Mr. Boudreaux. But I will say, too, some of the jurors on the last case said they had recently moved here. So you never know what someone's circumstances are as to why they have not been tracking this case like we have for the past 5+ years.
Right. And it will be, I think, just this trial. I think some people probably do have a little bit of Vallow Daybell, fatigue, if you will. And I think it'd be easy to say, well, this one maybe considered less important, but it's the same charge. And I think that she has such a mountain of, it's this mountain of information and this story. I mean, her story is huge. And so I think that it's hard to, if you're that invested and you have been there for the first 3 trials and you've been interested in that, and if you look on any of the, the online resources where people share information, whether it's Reddit or, Quora, wherever they're talking about this, there's still a lot of conversation about Lori Vallow Daybell and a lot of questions, and people still very engaged in what happens next. So let's get into kind of leading up to the trial. We often have a lot of these motions and hearings, and essentially the attorney's opportunity to, first of all, try to get this not to go to trial. That's clearly, that's a defense attorney, Lori Vallow Daybell, representing herself. So she is acting on her own interest here. But the idea would be that we don't have to do this, or these charges, it's unfair, or these charges are not called for. We shouldn't go to trial. This judge is a problem. Lots of different arguments. It seems that she has tried everything she possibly can to have this not go to trial now. Yeah. But what are some of those arguments? What have we seen in the last few weeks and few days?
Yeah, of course, Andrea. And, I agree. It seems like she's trying to throw every possible option she has at the wall and see if anything sticks, and then some. But, called to May 14th. That was one of the main pretrial hearings. It's typically a routine thing before you head into trial, but nothing is routine with this case. And as we've seen in previous trials, or at least the prior trial in Arizona, and maybe we'll make that distinction too, Andrea, is that we didn't hear from her really in her trial in Idaho because she had defenders working on her team there. She didn't really make a peep until her sentencing, but in Arizona, we got to see a lot of different versions of Lori in the courtroom, whether she was, more timid maybe with the jury or more sensitive, whether she was nice to a witness or maybe more intimidating toward a witness because she does have the ability to cross-examine witnesses. And then you almost could see this contentious relationship forming with Judge Boreski, and contentious from Lori's end because she would be snippy with him. I personally think that Judge Boreski has kept a pretty cool head with her,
very
given,
much so.
The way she's acted in the courtroom sometimes. And that was absolutely what we saw in that May 14th pretrial hearing, where she's making these arguments. She's saying, well, why can't I have these witnesses? Why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? And at one point, and we are about to play this for you, she asks the judge if he should get off the case. Take a listen.
Your Honor?
Yes.
I would have to ask that you would recuse yourself from the obvious personal bias that you have against me and send us to master calendar for this scheduling of a trial.
And what personal bias is that?
A lot, obviously, the personal bias that you're showing right now and that you've shown on the FTR several times during the trial.
Okay, well, I don't have any personal bias, all right? I've over-accommodated you on when you have to disclose things. In fact, your expert should be summarily precluded today, and I haven't done that. All right? So
you denied every single one of my motions since for a year and a half that I've been here. Every single one of my motions has been denied. And have any of those motions not have merit? You've denied every single motion.
I think I was here this morning about 15 minutes ago when I granted your motion to meet with your attorneys over the lunch hour. I have granted other motions of yours. Okay?
That's the first motion that you've ever granted.
Well,
in my behalf.
File motions that have a legal basis, and I might grant them.
So you're saying none of my motions have had merit?
Not many, no.
Not many. And then he ends that whole interaction with motion denied. So you talk about a level head, not to make light of it by any means, but it's almost comical in a sense of, it does seem so desperate, and it's interesting. It kind of like almost like talking to a child. You've never let me do anything. Well, you just did something. Well, okay, but that was the only thing, and then nothing else. And and we know, we've been there, we've listened, we know for sure that he has granted motions in her favor, but also him making the point of, it's not about not granting a motion, it's about the relevance or the legal grounds on which that argument stands. And so you can't make arguments that don't have legal basis and then be mad that I don't grant your motion. I think that's, he made that point very clearly, and then to your point, very calmly as well. And I think that she has tested his patience, and I think he's done a great job of being very level-headed and also very consistent. I have not seen him, treat her differently, other than to show some very mild frustration in a sense of just having to kind of explain the same things over and over, which we saw in the last trial, that, just that kind of that exhaustion of that's still not allowed. You cannot, or she would answer things or say, kind of, make comments after questions. And how many times did he have to say, that's not okay? So I think that's the only time really that we saw him get exhausted maybe.
Yeah, of course. And I think that's very understandable given the circumstances. And, we'll play a few more clips in a little bit of some more tense moments, as we get closer and closer to this trial starting here. But I'm wondering, Andrea, Ed, if you have thoughts on that, and I'll get back to, we'll move forward with this in a minute, but I'm wondering if you think this is any way a strategy of hers to try and maybe get rise out of the judge, and she could file a motion and say use it against him, maybe if he has a reaction. Again, I'm not saying he will do that, but I was stewing on that today as I was going back through some of the other hearings that have happened recently. And I'm just like, it feels like this has to be intentional in some way, shape, or form. What do you think?
Well, I think, it's interesting because it's on one side of that, I would say, I think that's such the probability of that is so low given just how calm he has been. I have not seen a single propensity for him to, kind of lose it so I think it's a weak strategy if that is the strategy. And at the same time, strategy in a sense of, I think that we have seen from the first moment in her last trial, again, from the moment that she began representing herself, we talked in previous episodes of Inside the Courtroom about, I don't think she did a terrible job, in the sense of questioning and holding her own, in those interactions. But from a strategy standpoint, I think there is a level of desperation that seems very obvious. And I think that this, to me, feels more like it's just, maybe this will work and why not try? Maybe not necessarily, expecting it to actually work.
Yeah. And this issue of, wanting to go before a different judge, she doesn't stop by just, voicing an oral argument in court. She actually puts a filing together asking for a new judge. And that was something that played out earlier this week. It was an emergency, maybe not an emergency, but it was a last minute hearing for oral arguments in front of a different judge where, I read the filing. She's accusing Judge Bresky of having a bias against her. And she specifically points to a moment in the last trial where she says, well, you actually, you answered this question, you scolded me for asking a question this way. There was an objection. And, you said, well, you're allowed to answer whether or not you're comparing yourself to, a biblical prophet or something along those lines.
Right.
And Lori was like, I was in no way referring to myself a prophet. So that was, a moment that stood out. And she's saying that was him showing bias, something he denied. There was a memo I had read that he had written after saying maybe that was an unnecessary comment, but it was in no way inappropriate because that was the vein of the question. But that's something she brings up. And she brings up the issue again of not granting motions, even though we have seen that happen. And, there is that issue of it has to be found in legal basis. But that's something we saw play out here. And I want to give you guys a warning. We're going to show this to you, but the video is a little rough to see. But this is essentially a compilation of Lori's argument, the state's argument, and what the judge, that is not Judge Bresky, ultimately decided about keeping Judge Bresky on this case. Take a listen.
There's several times that he made comments directly to me. I tried to address this with him directly in our last hearing on May 14th, where I asked him why he had denied every single motion that I had ever filed in the last year and a half. And he said that my motions had no merit. I asked him if my prior defense team, that he denied all of their motions, that they had no merit as well. And then I asked him, my prior defense team before that, all the motions they filed were denied, and did they have no merit at all either? And I asked him again if he would recuse himself from this case so that I could get a judge that was impartial and fair and have a fair trial. That is my right, my Sixth Amendment right and my 14th Amendment right to have a fair trial, an impartial trial, and not a judge who has some kind of bias against me.
All of the defendant's motions that she has filed have been without legal basis. They've been appropriately ruled on, and the state's motions that the state has won have been ruled on based upon, again, legal basis. So the fact, as the court is well aware, that the defendant has had all of the motions ruled against has no basis for bias if they're all been ruled on based upon the rules of law and the rules of evidence. So we see nothing that the defendant has provided here that would rise to a level to preclude or recuse Judge Bresky from this case.
The fact that you disagree with Judge Bresky's substantive legal rulings is not a valid basis under Rule 10.1 to grant your motion and give you a new judge. The standard in 10.1 is, has he demonstrated he can't be fair and impartial? And the fact that his rulings have not gone your way is not a valid basis to suggest that he can't be fair and impartial.
Certainly that would be a very very interesting standard. If that was the standard, if the judge doesn't agree with everything that you say, then he's clearly biased or clearly not able to be impartial. That wouldn't work well in many cases. Of course, judges have to make those rulings all of the time, and there are lots of different means in order to challenge those. But in this one, that judge making it very clear that there's just no bearing here, no basis here for her to get a new judge, which probably disappointing for her, but he was the judge in the last trial, and so we are still also waiting. He hasn't sentenced her in that form, the last trial, and so that will come after this next one. And so he still has a role. He is going, she's going to be in front of him, even if he were to, be a different judge. So it'll be interesting to play out, or to see this play out, and see if she's any different in her interactions with him. Having made those arguments, and if she tries to maybe point out some of that stuff during this trial.
Absolutely. And we got to see later that day, I mentioned that, grainy video. The reason we have that grainy video is because the hearing happened so quickly that we didn't even have time to get a camera in the courtroom. So later that day, we, were expecting each side to go over juror questionnaires in front of Judge Bresky. So this is really the moment where you see, again, Lori arguing to get him removed in the morning, and then in the afternoon, she's right back in front of him as they try to whittle down the questionnaires, bringing in people. So we go through that process, and I was in the courtroom for this. And, afterwards they say, okay, well, are there any motions we need to hear? And as you said, Andrea, we've seen this slew of motions to try and, disrupt this case or end this case from every which angle. And there's still some of those things on the table. We got to see her essentially argue with the judge again, and moments got tense. And one of the main points that we saw her argue was about the aggravating phase. And I know that was a term that came up in the last trial. And here in Arizona, essentially, if depending on what sort of crimes you're accused of, you will go into an aggravating phase. A lot of times people think that could only be for capital cases involving the death penalty, but not so. And this stems from Arizona case law that, requires this procedure to happen. It used to be the judge that made the determination for aggravating factors, whether something may have been dangerous or something of that nature. But now it's a jury, unless for some reason, like we saw in her last hearing, that she would stipulate to it, so to kind of avoid going through that. But that was essentially the crux of this argument here. So a little bit of confusing stuff, and a little bit of stuff that, is way down the line. Part of the reason why I think maybe Judge Bresky was like, why are you even bringing this up at this point? But Lori was essentially arguing, why does a jury need to hear this? Why can't we just determine this then? I need a new hearing for this. This needs to go to a grand jury. And, the judge really had to put her in her place more than once during this conversation. Take a listen.
I'm trying to explain it to you. The jury did find probable cause that this was a dangerous offense. It's included in your indictment. So they did find... They
didn't find these specific aggravators. Being a dangerous offense and these specific aggravators. Can I finish
what I said, what I was saying?
Right?
I didn't interrupt you. Can I finish? Okay. The jury did find probable cause on the dangerous allegation, all right? You're not entitled to a probable cause hearing on the other aggravators.
When is conspiracy to commit murder not a dangerous crime?
When someone says they're going to choke someone to death and they don't actually do it, it's not a dangerous crime.
So
no dangerous instrument or deadly weapon was used.
So because some instrument may or may not have been used in this crime, it's considered a dangerous crime?
Right.
And these aggravators that talk about something totally different don't have to be found after that it's found a dangerous crime?
Correct.
And that is supported by case law?
Yes.
So that what? When you go to appeal, you can't say it was a non-dangerous crime?
All right. I don't know what to tell you, all right? There was a case that came out about 15 to 20 years ago now called Blakely that said a jury had to determine aggravating factors. Okay, before that, a judge determined aggravating factors at sentencing. Now a jury has to determine it. The reason it's not done in the guilt phase is we don't want the jury to confuse the issues. We want the jury to decide first whether someone's guilty or not guilty, whether the state has proved its burden beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't want them to start thinking about other things like aggravators if they have questions about whether or not the person's even guilty. It tends to confuse the jury and confuse the issues for them. So that's why we do the aggravators in a separate hearing.
There's a good example of where he seems exhausted. He seems a bit exasperated, but still very calm and explaining and making it clear. I'm explaining yet again how this works. Do you know what I really want to know after watching that clip is what those two, there are two attorneys sitting next to her, and they are essentially her kind of advisors, or they are there to help her if she has questions, or I think probably just to kind of help explain maybe some of those technical aspects that you just may not know, not being an attorney. So when they write notes to each other, one wrote a note to the other one, I want to know what they're saying. I want to know what they're
Yes, I do too. And I would love to go out and have dinner with both of them, because I feel like they would have some fascinating insights. But same with the judge, same with anyone involved in this case. But,
absolutely.
You know, that's a great point, Andrea. And I'll point out too, I was sitting right behind them while this was happening. Right. And yeah, you can tell, like, these are people, they're called her advisory council, but they were essentially the public defenders she would have had if she was not representing herself. So these two were involved in her last case. They sat through that. And again, they kind of have to sit there and let Lori do what Lori does. She'll lean to them at certain points and, it sounds like solicit some insights or advice. And we know that, they were with her going through the juror questionnaires. We know that they have interactions with her, and it seems that they're involved in, any of the processes. They may go to the jail, they may meet her at a certain point to, be involved in everything that she's doing. But yeah, it would be fascinating to know what they're looking at. However, I will point out too that we have a specific instruction from the judge that we cannot zoom in to anything on that table. So that may be a mystery to us. But, you mentioned, I'll point out that interaction we just saw, it went on for several minutes. We only played a portion of it. And you could tell that he was, as you said, exhausted, exasperated, but like he went through it maybe 4 or 5 times going over this. And I, again, think that speaks to just the nature of someone representing themselves. And that wasn't the only thing that she argued in that hearing. It was kind of snowballing. So toward the end of it, speaking of her advisory council, she asked the judge, because she claimed this was an issue during her last trial, that when they do, the sidebars, she didn't have it. There weren't enough headsets for everyone on her team, because she has an investigator that sits with her. She has these 2 advisory councils. Sometimes there was someone else, some sort of assistant or clerk or paralegal maybe that was working with her. So she has people that are sitting with her at the defense table. But she said, well, are we going to fix this so more people can have this? And the judge said, well, look, technically in that courtroom, we can only have 5. I have to have one. The state has to have one. There are, the court reporter has to have one. There's an assistant that has to have one. So like you are getting the other 2 that we have. That is the max. You are getting the most out of anybody in this party. And she was like, well, I need to hear what my counsel has to say. And he said, well, actually, you don't necessarily need to hear what they have to say, because you are representing yourself. You made this decision. They are, and she's like, she gets snippy with him again. And she's like, well, you assigned them to be part of this. And he's like, well, I did, because that's, procedure here in Arizona. And you can tell she's almost like, it just feels like she's arguing for the sake of arguing.
Yes.
She's saying, why can't they hear this too? And he's like, well, they don't have to. And she's like, well, you made me have these people. Like so it's like, does she want it? You can tell, Andrea, as you said, as you see, she does use them. She does consult with them. So it's it's been such a mess. And I'll say, at least sitting in the courtroom during that latest back and forth, it's cringy. It's really cringy to see too. Yeah. And just kind of, the reporters talking afterwards, we're all kind of like, oof. Those are some moments. And you wonder what version this next jury, once we get to them, is going to get.
Yeah, it's true. And it is kind of that, well, I think what she was trying to say is you made them sit here and now you won't even let me hear from them. And so but that, like you said, that's not a luxury, but what you have is the best we can give you. And even that is more than you said you wanted, because you said you didn't want any attorney, that you wanted to represent yourself. And so I think that his point, I think most of us understand exactly what he's saying. And you also understand the law to understand what she is required to have, what, that he is clearly, I think we said this during the last one, I have no doubt that he is being very, very cautious to avoid exactly what she has tried to claim, which is bias and, an unfair trial. And I think he has gone above and beyond to avoid any obvious missteps that would potentially give her more fuel for that fire.
Absolutely. And I do think back to, again, I've interviewed Rachel Smith, the attorney or one of the prosecutors in Idaho a few times, and she said, Lori's MO is to blame anybody but herself. So you see her,
right,
accusing the judge of bias, accusing accusing all these different things, the state of withholding the evidence. There's,
Sure.
We've seen so many accusations here. And as the judge pointed out, there hasn't been legal basis for him to find or approve any of these accusations. So what does that
and
tell
he
you?
said, I've even let you do things that I didn't have to let you do, right? I've let you have these, out of after hour hearings or conferences or, communication that may not otherwise be allowed. I've let those things happen. So again, not outside of the law, but he has clearly he has some discretion that he can use. And he has said, I have allowed what I can allow, and probably he feels he has been lenient in the sense that he does give all that explanation. And, we, after watching so many trials, this isn't necessary usually. In most cases, if you have a bar attorney who understands the law and is well versed in it and practices it regularly, these aren't the kind of interactions you see a lot in the courtroom. There can certainly be challenges and conversations, or challenges come up, motions come up, but you don't see this kind of needing to explain over and over the same idea. And so that has to be unique for him, but also I think exhausting is probably the right word. So he will probably be very ready to have this final trial over.
Yeah. And, as we mentioned right at the beginning of our show here, we're already seeing a slight delay because, the jury selection today, as I said, it was supposed to be finalized. It was not. So that's been punted to hopefully Monday morning. That's the expectation as we are talking right now on Friday evening. But who knows what may change over the weekend. But our expectation is that, at least in the proceedings this afternoon, the judge laid out that, we will bring these potential jurors back in. I will be allowed to be in the courtroom for that. But again, no cameras at that point in time. And the jurors will be there. They will hopefully whittle down to 16 people. Again, 12 will be the ones that ultimately deliberate in this case, while other 4 are alternates, and they have alternates, as we've discussed, in case someone has something come up. We've seen them, jurors get removed. So there will be alternates that are eventually selected who will unfortunately not get to deliberate. I'm sure that must be a tough position to sit through a case and not be able to make a decision, but that's just how it is. I think they're doing everything out of, an abundance of caution is the term we've heard a lot leading up to these proceedings. But essentially, they'll whittle it down to 16 people. And we are expecting once they whittle it down, they will be sworn in, and we are expecting them to go right into opening statements as long as this jury is seated at a reasonable hour. The court schedule here locally in Arizona is supposed to be 10:30 to 4:30. That's what we've been seeing. That's essentially what we saw the last time. And, day by day, things could change, but that's what we're expecting. And so Andrea, we may get openings Monday, we may not, but if not Monday, I would expect it would happen soon after on Tuesday.
Good. Are they doing the 5-day week this time? They did not have trial on Friday, on the Friday last week or during the last trial. What is the schedule the same this time? Or are they going all week?
So the plan was to go all week, although Friday, June 6th, they had a dark day because the prosecutor said that they're bringing in some witnesses out of state, it sounds like. And we'll get to our expectations in just a moment once we nail down the schedule, which is still in flux as of this afternoon. But originally that day, Friday, was supposed to be dark. But now with the shift in opening statements, then in the jury selection, they may resume that day. We're expecting the week after to June 13th. That's what they have booked out. Although the state has indicated that it may take them 4 to 5 days to go through their case. Remains to be seen whether Lori Vallow Daybell will call anyone in her case this time. So it's unclear, but I think the overall expectation is that we are going to be done by or before June 13th. So that would be roughly 2 weeks.
Okay. And they, the last time I know they had planned for several weeks. It only took, 7 days? Is that right? Remind me how
I
many
think the
days I think we were.
testimony, and then ultimately the jury got it in a late afternoon. They deliberated for a brief period and then
Right.
continued the next day. So it was a matter of hours, even though it was spun over 2 days. But
Sure.
yeah,
Much shorter than
that's
what
the
we
expectation.
anticipated. Yeah. I
Yes,
mean,
much
that's
shorter.
it
And I
went
think
much
that's,
shorter than what they had planned. Yeah.
yes. And they do have, beyond the 13th, the judge had said I believe, had some training. So the week after that is off the calendar regardless. And then they do have June 23rd, that, Monday after, they have that reserved just in case. But everyone else,
Okay.
everyone is saying they do not think we will get to that
Right.
point. But you just never know with this case. So with that said, Andrea,
very
do we
true.
want to talk about what we are expecting here once we
Yes,
actually
let's
get
do
into
it.
the testimony?
Yes, let's do it.
So, yeah. So I think, it's been interesting. We've been able to look at the witness list.
Right.
A lot of the usual suspects, not real suspects, I'm sorry to say that, but a lot of the usual people we've seen before, a lot of familiar
Right.
faces, including Brandon Boudreaux. Like we talked about
Yes.
earlier, he doesn't make a lot of public statements or speaking, he doesn't really speak out about this. We understand he's been kind of waiting in the rafters until it's been his, case front and center here. But his family has put out statements after every conviction, saying they're so sorry to, people impacted by Tylee, JJ,
Right.
Tammy, Charles's deaths. We understand that he and Charles were close. Like Brandon was part of Lori's family. So,
Right.
I know we hear sometimes this is almost like the forgotten case or the last case, or not, maybe not as interesting to some people, but I do think it's interesting. And I do understand why the prosecutor here in Arizona is moving forward, because he is a victim of a crime. At least that's what they are alleging.
Sure.
They say they have the evidence to show this. So I can understand it's been a long time coming here. Again, this alleged shooting happened back, or we know a shooting happened. The allegation is that Lori and her brother conspired to do the shooting. This was back in 2019. So we are expecting the state to show the body camera footage. It'll be interesting to see that body camera, Andrea, because we received it in a records request, but it was redacted in a way, like they blurred most of it out. So we could hear audio from it, but in court, we're probably expecting to see the clear version of Brandon's response to the shooting. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, he says that, Green Jeep, he kind of was already, the wheels were already turning, that maybe Alex Cox was involved there. And I'll note on Alex Cox, Andrea, that it's Lori's brother. He died in December 2019, apparently of natural causes. So he's been considered the co-conspirator in not just this case, but the death of Charles Vallow, the deaths in Idaho. But he was never charged in any of these cases because charges were filed after he had died. So we'll make that very clear to people. It's only Lori who is being charged now. We believe that charges were actually submitted against Chad Daybell, but the prosecutor did not ultimately bring them in both this case and Charles Vallow's death. So I think people largely believe that he was also involved or accused of being involved, but those are not charges that Chad Daybell is facing. So
we do know he was part of the picture. Right.
Oh,
I mean, we know that he was part of the picture in all of that, and she was very much with him, during all of this. And I think that has been made clear through those text messages and those interactions that we have seen in multiple trials now. And so, no doubt that he was, in some way connected, but as you said, not the charges filed. And I think, what you say about, is this the case? Why are we trying this? One could argue that Brandon, because he is still living, justice for him and being able to have that accountability could be, you could argue even more important. This could, in that way, this might be the most important case. And that is not to take away from the deaths that happened. I mean, these have all been traumatic and tragic cases that we have listened to. But in saying that he's still alive doesn't intend, I don't intend to minimize, though, the impact on him, which I think that is what is so interesting about this case. And also I understand what the prosecutor is saying, is that's just as important, is to have accountability for this. And we've talked about before, I mean, a prosecutor, if there is a case, they don't usually say, oh, well, you've been convicted of something else, we'll ignore any of the other crimes, because they also know that anything can happen. And so should she have any of the other convictions, if something, if an appeal came through, or if something were to be overturned for some reason, we don't expect that, but if that were to happen, they also, want to want to have this essentially on the record. And so,
yes,
I think that's something that I think it's very usual and very understandable.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say, Andrea, too, that even, something that's clear to us, but people always wonder, like, does the jury know about her backstory? Will they hear about any of this? And what we saw in Charles Vallow's, her conspiracy to commit murder case for his death, no, they can't. They have to be very narrow. So we are expecting to see a very narrow case here. And this does go back to Idaho. I saw on the witness list Detective Ray Hermosillo. He's with the Rexburg Police Department up in your neck of the woods, Andrea, up in Idaho. And we understand that, we talk about connecting dots in this case. And, eventually it was, them saying, okay, we might be looking for this Jeep. We think it could be up. Like they are piecing. They're like, oh, wait, that might be connected to the family that the grandma just said that she hasn't seen her grandson. And, it's really snowballing there. But what did you think about seeing his name on the witness list?
I would expect that's exactly what he will speak to. I would expect that he will speak to identifying the Jeep, maybe the characteristics of the Jeep. I know that, they talked about different, potentially, his eyewitness, Brandon's eyewitness accounts of the Jeep. I would assume that Detective Hermosillo may talk about, how that matched, but I wouldn't expect him, of course, because of what we know, he won't be able to disclose and won't be asked about any of the other interactions that he had or any of the other evidence and any of the other information that he, of course, was looking into here in Idaho and that we know and we have heard his testimony on in the other cases. And, as we talked about those aggravating circumstances earlier, remember that is when it's that phase where we would expect to hear all of those all the other information, the previous convictions and things like that, which is exactly why we think that she chose to waive that last time, because that wasn't something she was willing to sit through. And so so that it is a very, it's important, because I know people get frustrated because in layman's terms, you want the jury to know everything. That's just not how the process works. And so, as difficult as it is to understand that. Yeah.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was going to say, you reminded me when you were saying, they can't say this, they can't say that, but that's actually what that came up yesterday in the contentious hearing where Lori is fighting with the judge. But she, one of the things she asked, she's like, well, how do I, what are we going to do to prevent me opening the door to Idaho? Essentially is what she asked of the judge, because there were points during her last trial where he said, are you sure you want to go down that path? Because that could open a door. And, he essentially said, well, the witnesses will be instructed to not, only speak to what is at hand. And if there is, some path where we might be opening a door or might be doing that, then he said, maybe we'll call for a break. So I think everyone is on the same page that they do not want to bring in any of her past that is not relevant in this case, because that could upend the whole trial. It could cause, an outcome that maybe people don't want, or it could cause grounds for appeal. There's a lot of things that could come up if that door does get opened. And it could also be really insightful for the jury if, if Lori opens the door herself, So
I was just going to say, that's
really interesting.
Yeah, it's her herself who was opening that door in her last trial, and she was the one who the judge kept admonishing about, be careful about that. So it's interesting to hear her say, how are we going to avoid that? Almost to imply that the state would do that.
It's not her
but
fault.
It was her herself.
Yeah,
right, exactly. It was her in the last trial who actually ended up being on the verge of that a couple of times. And I think, it's easy to, you kind of have to think through, you have to almost be thinking about 10 steps ahead, with this question, as he said, with this question, it leads to another, it implies or it opens the door to then be able to explore that information, because once it is introduced, then the state has the opportunity to question about that, to ask more about that. Yeah. And so I think that's something that I think she has failed to recognize sometimes. And so now to hear her say that she's worried about somebody else doing that, or the other side doing that, or the state doing that, the prosecution, it's kind of interesting. But it kind of also goes back to what we said, and we have said all along, is that I do believe that to follow her path, and that is true. This has been the truth, from the moment that we met her and we started to hear their story. the twists and the turns and the circles and the trying to follow the path has been anything but simple from moment one. When we started learning about her and Chad Daybell.
No. And, speaking of circles, Andrea, someone who is not on the witness list that we keep waiting to see when she might come up, and she has not been called to testify in any of the other trials, but it is Lori's niece, Melanie Boudreaux was her name when she was married to Brandon Boudreaux. She has since remarried. She's now Melanie Pulowski is her name. We've interviewed her back in 2020, and she stood by Lori before she was charged or at least charged with the deaths of her children. But was in the circle with Chad and Lori and Alex Cox. She moved to Idaho with Lori. She had a place in the same apartment complex. And we understand that she was part of these, this dark religious circle that, according to court records, Chad Daybell was kind of guiding people and believing, telling people that there are light and dark spirits. People are zombies that would need to die in order for their spirits to be saved. So all of these bizarre doomsday beliefs, she was caught up in that. And we know that police have talked to her at various points. We know she's been involved, but I would think that she may have relevant information in not just this specific case, but other cases, but she is not on that list. What do you think about that?
No. Well, and I actually find her very interesting, and I find everything around her very interesting. The fact that her current husband, as you mentioned, she is remarried. Her current husband actually tried to help investigators, speak to her about this and kind of wanting to understand more about her involvement in things. I have always wondered if there was some sort of agreement, and I don't know. I'm ignorant to how that would work. I do know, of course, prosecutors and investigators do, certainly use informants and things like that, where you wouldn't expect them. Maybe there's a deal in terms of you give us this information, we won't pursue charges against you. I have no reason and no proof of that whatsoever. And I don't know that we would. I guess that's the real question in my mind is, would we know that? Was there early on, was there something that she was able to provide police or investigators or, law enforcement that gave them information about Lori that then allowed her to avoid criminal prosecution? And said, I don't know that, but that's always been a question in my mind.
I don't have the answer to that either, Andrea, but we do know that she has never been charged in any of these cases. I don't even want to say, thinking back here locally in Arizona, she's not even been maybe a suspect in any case. I'm trying to think if we've ever asked that. I don't believe she's ever been a person of interest, but we know that she has talked to investigators and she was never, ever charged in the Chandler case, in the Gilbert case, or the cases in Idaho. So I want to make that very, very clear.
Sure.
But to your point, she is a very interesting character, and she most certainly was a part of all of this, or privy very at least to maybe things that had been going on. Yeah, maybe not everything. And if I'm remembering again, this would have been about 5 years ago. We spoke to her. This was during COVID. I remember we went to her lawyer's office. We sat down with her and her new husband, Ian. And he's also interesting. As you said, Andrea, he, helped, I believe it was the FBI trying to maybe record some conversations, just try to get to the bottom of this, because they had married pretty quickly. I believe it was like within a week or 10 or, within 2 weeks-ish, probably a little less than that, of meeting each other. So, and they're, as far as I know, still together. She's been largely out of the circle after, the bodies of Tylee and JJ were discovered in Chad Daybell's backyard. But yeah, she originally stood by Lori. She stood by her uncle, Alex Cox. This would be Lori and Alex's sister's daughter. Their sister has since passed. And it sounded like their niece, Melanie, was very close to them. And as you said early on, maybe like a bit of a daughter or a best friend, but they were very, very close, it seemed.
Right. Yeah, little sister, but yeah, exactly, daughter. But they said she looked up to Lori. I mean, I remember that in her trial here in Idaho. They talked about really, kind of admiring her and essentially kind of painting the picture of her being almost potentially, under her spell, if you will, and one of the people that was very much, very much willing to do whatever Lori asked, and to very much into those religious beliefs. And as you said, those dark spirits always kind of coming back to not only, a belief, but also leading to that justification. Is it a justification for the killings? And that is how it has been presented in all of these trials. And I would expect that we will hear that again in this one. We will hear some of those come into play, but it'll be interesting to see. It's been pretty easy to connect the dots on why it was, why were they wanting to get Charles Vallow, essentially out of the way. Those are things that we heard people say, that they wanted him out of the way so they could be together. The children, we heard, reason, motive in terms of financial gain, using their, the Social Security benefits and money from Charles Vallow as well. And so what will be interesting is to hear what was the motive here. Why was it necessary or important to get Brandon, quote unquote, out of the way? And because it wasn't successful, will we hear any information about, what happened there, and what happened after that unsuccessful shooting? He survived, and then was there any other, do they have any other information or evidence that they potentially tried something else, or what did they try something before this? I mean, that all of those are the questions I wonder, just kind of all of the pieces of this puzzle that will come together, because as you said, this case has been sort of overshadowed by all of the others, and so we just simply don't know a lot about this investigation, or a lot about what they uncovered. And so in that way, I'm very interested to see what kind of evidence they present.
Absolutely. And I agree. I think this is the case we maybe know the least about. I do know, I went back to look to see if I can get the charging documents, and I realized that they are still under seal. So we actually don't, we know the charge, of course, and we know the case, the basis of the case is this shooting. But I would imagine that we're going to learn many more details during the trial once we eventually get going, likely early next week, Monday or Tuesday is the expectation. But I think the big question in all of this, and we've touched on it too, is, will Lori present her own case this time? And we did not see her, there was every indication that she wanted to in the, in her first murder conspiracy trial here. But when the time, when push came to shove, she said, I will rest too. And she, kind of took a weekend. She made it sound like maybe something would change. But in this case, leading up to it, Andrea, we've heard her try to include, we talk about the inner circle. There's Melanie Gibb. That's a name that is familiar to folks up in Idaho. Zulema Pastenis, that was Alex Cox's widow. She was another one that kind of married him pretty quickly, but was part of the religious circle. And, she's another one that Lori is, we know the state's interviewed them. Both have testified in Idaho, but it seems like they're not going to be called by the state in this case. Lori said, well, they have information. This was another point where the judge was kind of pushing and pulling her, saying just because someone has met these people doesn't mean they have relevant information to this case. But it sounded like they, he didn't totally rule them out, but it sounded like Lori probably wouldn't be able to call them if she could. And then she was still trying to get her, an expert witness involved. But again, whether she actually decides to present something remains to be seen. Whether she takes the stand herself remains to be seen, although that seems less likely this time because, as you said, that opens the door to what her prior convictions are. And that's something she probably does not want to do in front of a jury that will be deliberating whether or not she's guilty in this current case.
And remember it too, is that conspiracy to commit murder, just like in Idaho, and it is treated very similar to if you were the person pulling the trigger yourself or committing the act yourself. And so there's very little, very little delineation there in terms of the charge, and the sentencing also very similar. And so
sentence is 25 to life here in Arizona.
Yeah, a very serious offense that I know she is taking seriously. Of course, she has her convictions here. So, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see what we saw this in the last trial. She had a whole list, and remember, the subpoenas, no subpoenas. She wasn't sure, even though that whole list of witnesses that she said she wanted permission to include. And, there's question about whether, discovery and all of that, because prosecutors have to know who you're going to call. So I'm guessing that I'm expecting probably to see the exact same thing. that, she'll have the list, but those won't ever materialize, and she will rest without any evidence. But could be wrong, and we will only know as it happens, right? And so we're going to be there.
Absolutely.
That's right. We're going to be there to watch it all, and we hope that you will come along with us, because each day following the trial, we will be here, and we will take you inside the courtroom for the third and, we believe, final Lori Vallow Daybell conspiracy to commit murder trial. So we hope you will join us right back here for that every evening starting on Monday. We'll hope to see you then.